planning and life. And Tim will provide an introduction to today's webinar. And so I'll hand over to Tim now.
Thank you, Mark. The Council is updating its planning policy framework in order to better address the key priorities of the Council, in particular the climate and ecological emergencies. We're updating parts of our core strategy and placemaking plan through the local plan parcel update and preparing 3 supplementary planning documents on transport and development, HMO occupation, and energy efficiency, retrofitting and sustainable construction. As part of our commitment to give people a bigger say, we have published on the 27th of August 3 key draft documents for consultation. It's really important you take this opportunity to submit your comments, which be carefully considered and will help influence our policies. The updated policies are crucial as they will help shape the future development and change in our area. Today's session is one of a series of webinars that we arranged in order to explain some of the key policy updates and changes and outline how you can engage in the process and submit your comments. It's also an opportunity to ask questions of our officers to help inform your responses. It's lovely to have Karen and Alice here today, who are going to deal with some very difficult questions. I know that, it's a very difficult line. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to them to finish introducing themselves and present what they need to present to you today.
Thank you, Tim. I believe now that Caru and Alice are going to do a double-handed presentation between them to start off with. And then we do have some submitted questions to go through after the presentation. But as I say, if anyone's got any comments or questions they'd like to submit, please do these as we go along and we'll pick them up as well as we can throughout the rest of the webinar. So over to Caru.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm Kauru from Planning Policy, and I'm here with my colleagues Alice and Anne. And if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen. And so I put the presentation up, then I hope everybody can see okay. Yeah, okay. So, right, today's session is about HMOs, that is houses in multiple occupation. And but also we're doing consultation on a number of documents. So we touch on the other documents as well. So, right, to start with, so what is a house in multiple occupation? So it's that is a house or flat that is occupied by 3 or more people from 2 or more households. So then they share the basic amenities such as bathroom, toilet, and cooking facilities. There are some exemptions. For example, if the property is occupied by the property owner, so then they have 2 lodgers. So that means there's 3 households, but that is exempt. It's just like this is the homestay kind of situation. So the house occupier owner have 2 lodgers. So that doesn't count as HMO. So they don't need to have planning permission to operate that or licensing. So then another area is there's a 2 in a planning term. There's a 2 use classes to cover HMO, and the one is class C4. The C4 we call it smaller HMOs. So that is the occupied by 3 to 6 people, and over 6 people, it's a different use class called sui generis. So that is its own kind. So that is more than 6 people living in one property. So it's the role of HMOs. That is very important part of the district housing stock. That's provide homes for the wider range of people. That's a more affordable form of accommodation. So that's we have a student living in HMOs and also young professionals living in HMOs. And most of the HMO occupiers and the landlords, they operate smoothly and they don't cause any issues. But there's sometimes we see the issues coming from HMOs. It's often we have, one of the major issues, complaints we receive is noise and disturbance, maintenance issues such as unkept gardens, waste management, car parking, and also that's all affecting on local communities. So before go into the detail of HMOs, I just wanted to touch on wider planning system. So in England, the planning system should be genuinely plan-led. So that is set in a national planning policy framework, which we have to be in compliance with. And planning decisions, such as planning permissions, must be taken in accordance with development plan, unless material consideration indicates otherwise. So for the Bath and North East Somerset Council, development plans are local plan, it's a core strategy and placemaking plan, and also the West of England joint waste core strategy. So local plan, core strategy, placemaking plan set out high level planning policy. So then these policies are often supported by supplementary planning documents. For the HMOs, we have a parent policy and they're supported by supplementary planning document, which now I can pass on to Al to go through.
Thanks, Gary. Yes, so the current policy relating to HMOs that we have is policy H2, and that's in the placemaking plan. And that sets out the various criteria that we assess when we're determining a planning application for a change of use of a residential dwelling to an HMO. So that includes, amongst other criteria, seeking to restrict HMOs in areas where a high concentration already exists. And then to support policy H2, the council also has an HMO Supplementary Planning Document, which provides further detail and guidance on the topic. And the SPD's main focus is around the tests that we undertake to determine whether a planning application might lead to an unbalanced mix of housing in an area with regards to the concentration of HMOs. Go to the next slide there, please. Thank you. So following stakeholder engagement sessions with various parties that we carried out earlier this year, we've drafted updates to policy H2 as part of the local plan partial update and updates to the HMO SPD, both of which are out for consultation at the moment until the 8th of October. So first I'll run through the draft policy proposed within the partial update, and then I'll provide some detail on the changes to the SPD as well. Go to the next slide there. So starting off with the draft changes to policy H2, our draft policy seeks to increase the scope of the policy, which currently only refers to applications for change of use from residential to HMO, so that it'll now refer to new build HMOs, the change of use from other uses to HMOs, so that it could include retail or commercial units changing to HMOs, and also the intensification of a small C4 HMO to a large sui generis HMO. And in terms of the reference to the intensification of an HMO, in practice, it means that any planning application for such an intensification will be assessed against the same criteria as an application for a new HMO. So in areas where a high concentration of HMOs already exist, an application for intensification of a small HMO to a large HMO would likely be refused. Another change to policy H2 is the introduction of the requirement that all new or intensified HMOs must achieve an energy performance certificate of C or better, unless any exemptions apply, which I'll discuss a little bit later on in the presentation, because they're set out in the draft SPD. And this policy, the energy performance certificate policy, has been included in the partial update in response to the council's declaration of a climate emergency. And that's also combined with an attempt to bring the general energy performance of HMOs in the district in line with the general housing stock. So within the general housing stock, we've got 41.7% of properties have an EPC rating of C or better, whereas in the HMO stock, only 18.4% meet that rating. And of course, properties with a higher rating, reduce energy demand and lower energy costs for occupiers. And as HMOs provide an important form of accommodation for lower income individuals and young people, sort of young workers, the council see it as an opportunity to bring the efficiency of HMO stock in line with the general housing, and therefore lowering energy bills for lower income individuals and providing accommodation quality improvements that are associated with improved EPC ratings as well. And then relating to that, in terms of quality of accommodation, another change to policy H2 that we're proposing is a requirement for all new or intensified HMOs to provide a good standard of accommodation. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that later on in the presentation, because that is also included in the HMO SPD. Slide, please. Thank you. I've just popped a slide in here in relation to our updated purpose-built student accommodation policy. It's a new policy and it seeks to restrict purpose-built accommodation to allocated sites, so on campus, or elsewhere in the district, but only where there's a need demonstrated through an agreement between a developer and an educational establishment. Go to the next slide, please. So moving on to the draft HMO Supplementary Planning Document, or SPD, the first thing to mention is that our 10% concentration threshold is being retained at 10%. And the threshold relates to the proportion of HMOs within an area and the percentage of HMOs which the council considers to be a balanced concentration. So that threshold is retained at 10%, but we have added some additional text to the guidance to confirm that if a new HMO tips the threshold over 10%, the application would be refused. So the threshold is staying the same, but we've just added a bit of guidance on how it should be applied. Something we talked about with stakeholders throughout the engagement sessions was whether purpose-built student accommodation, or PBSA, should be included in the HMO concentration threshold test when you're calculating the concentration in a set area. And no evidence has arisen through consultation and engagement to suggest that issues arising from PBSA are similar enough or frequent as to justify inclusion within the HMO concentration test. So PBSA won't be included in the test, in that calculation test. Go to the next slide there, please, Kerry. Thank you. The next updates in the SPD relate to the tests which are undertaken to determine whether a planning application for a new or intensified HMO will cause any harm or lead to an unbalanced mix in an area. The tests that are currently used are in 3 stages. The first is a sandwich test, which checks whether proposals result in any residential property being sandwiched between 2 HMOs. The second is a test to assess whether a proposal is located in a census output area with over 10% concentration of HMOs. And then if it is, we move on to the third test, which assesses whether there is over 10% concentration of HMOs within an immediate 100 meters surrounding a property. Now, the second test, the census output area test, was included in the 2017 SPD, which is the current SPD, because HMO mapping wasn't available to the public in order for them to be able to carry out the 100-meter radius test themselves. So the census output area test provided that way to sort of understand whether a proposal might likely be acceptable or not. If you go to the next slide there, Kerry. Thank you. But yeah, so the HMO data is now available. So we're removing the census output area test, that element of the test, which simplifies the test process and ensures that all applications are tested using the same process, which is now the sandwich test, followed by the 100-meter radius test. Go to the next slide. Thank you. And next, we'll talk about the sandwich test. So we're retaining the sandwich test in its current form, but we are adding additional guidance relating to how the sandwich test is applied to flatted developments. So the guidance now defines an occurrence of sandwiching where a residential C3 flat would be adjoined on 2 or more sides by HMOs, but that doesn't include those located sort of diagonally above or below the unit. We have included a clause within the guidance which allows an applicant to provide evidence of some form of mitigation or circumstantial evidence to show that the sandwich test need not be applied to a flatted development, because there are slight differences between flatted accommodation and houses. So examples of that might be, the number of bedrooms or management considerations, or the quality of sound insulation in the flatted apartment block. Next slide, please. And we've also changed slightly the way in which the 100-meter radius test is carried out. The current test requires us to draw a 100-meter radius around an application site, within which all properties count towards the concentration calculation. And then at the moment, properties on the edge of the 100-meter radius are only included if their central point is within the radius line. But that has caused some ambiguity for both applicants and officers carrying out the tests as to where the central point of a unit falls. So in order to sort of provide a clearer approach for officers and applicants, we'll now count any properties where any part of the site boundary falls within that radius line. So you can see the example on your screen there, that the properties on the edge of the radius are included where the radius cuts through any part of the site boundary. So those blue dots show the units that would be counted, and that's both C3 residential and HMOs. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I talked earlier about the new requirement within policy H2 that all new and intensified HMOs need to achieve that energy performance certificate rating of C or better. And to support that policy, the HMO SPD sets out the exemptions that will be relevant to the requirement. So if evidence exists to show that any of the following examples shown on the screen there apply, then the C rating won't be required. And so I'll just run through them. The requirement won't apply where the cost of making the cheapest recommended improvement would exceed £10,000, and that includes VAT, or where all relevant energy efficiency improvements for the property have been made already, or there aren't any that could be made to start with, and that the property remains below EPCC. Where the proposed energy efficiency measures are not appropriate for the property due to potential negative impact on fabric or structure, and where the proposed energy efficiency measures would amount to harm to the significance of a heritage asset. And where those exemptions are relevant, any planning application that's submitted would need to be supported by evidence from relevant independent experts, so say structural engineer or heritage expert, and submitted with the planning application to be assessed alongside the application. The next slide, please. Thank you. And then finally, to support the new requirement at policy H2 relating to providing a good standard of accommodation, the HMO SPD sets out guidance on what is considered to be a good standard of accommodation, and that includes minimum room size standards for bedrooms and shared spaces, and that's in line with the HMO licensing standards. Sound reduction measures, the recommended sound reduction measures includes things like soft closers on doors and sound deadening material on stairs, and then looking at the sort of plans for new HMOs to see if rooms are located in areas that aren't, so common room areas aren't adjacent to sort of bedrooms in properties adjacent next door properties, and then also looking at recommendations for ventilation, particularly looking at how you can maintain a secure situation in a house, but with ventilation. So for example, use of trickle vents, and that's looking to minimize occurrence of damp and mold, etc. And I think I'll pass you back to Carrie now. She'll talk to you about the actual consultation itself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. Yeah, so this consultation is open until 8th of October. So this consultation on this houses in multiple occupation supplementary planning document, as well as a local plan partial update, so the parents' policies. And so also we have 2 other supplementary planning documents on consultation. So one is a transport and development SPD supplementary planning document, And then that SPD will set out the parking standard. And also it's another SPD is energy efficiency, fitting and sustainable construction SPD. So that will set out the guidance on improving building performance and sustainable construction. And yeah, so that's also consultation. So it's all documents available from the council website. And we are encouraging online responses because it's particularly for core strategy. This consultation is a formal stage, so we have to fill in the set format that goes straight to the planning inspectorate. So it's we are asking people to fill in the online form, and but also we understand some people don't have a full access to computer and website, so we will accept the paper copies as well. So, and as I mentioned earlier, planning application will be determined in accordance with the development plans we are consulting on. So it is a very important stage of planning, and we really encourage people to get involved. And if you know, if you can encourage your local neighbors and communities to respond, that would be really great. And so we have series of events organized, some briefings, and also webinars. And this webinar is our second one we're doing, but we had one last week, so to cover local plan partial update, sort of general policies. So that will be on the web in YouTube shortly. And also we planned another webinar on transport and development on the 7th of September. And zero carbon development and energy efficiency webinar on the 13th. Then we go back to the general. We do another general webinar on the 15th. So it's we put this YouTube address you can access. And also if you are interested to join another webinar, please visit this website to register. And if you have any questions, send the email to planning policy as set up on the slides. So this is the end of our seminar, our presentation, and yeah, we're happy to take questions.
Thank you, Caro and Alice. That was really interesting. I do have one question here that's come in from Chris Beasley. It's quite a long question, so bear with me. I'll read it right in full. What is Bain's response to the following FOBRA suggestion? The August 2021 topic paper on HMOs accepts paragraph 2.8 that one of two tipping points beyond which a community is considered to become unbalanced is when HMO occupants exceed 20% of the population in the local area. In its response to the consultation on the 2017 HMO SPD, dated the 10th of September 2017, FOBRA proposed that a further test is applied to take account of the proliferation of PBSAs, which also significantly stifle the SPD's stated aim of achieving balanced communities. Where an HMO is proposed in an area where the PBSA already exists, or vice versa, FOBRA proposes that the proposed 10% of properties within 100 meters test is extended such that planning permission for an HMO or PBSA would be refused in the number of HMO and PBSA occupants combined would exceed 20% of the local population if permission were granted. So who would like to take a stab at answering that one?
Sure, I think that one's for me. Thank you,
Alice.
Mark.
Okay,
And thanks, Chris, as well. I think the starting point on that is that that 20% population figure relates to specifically HMO occupiers, and that sort of relates to those issues that are currently they commonly occur when the population mix includes 20% or more HMO occupiers specifically, and it doesn't specify student housing in general. So we spent quite a long time analysing complaints. We looked at complaints mapping throughout the district with a focus on complaints made about HMOs specifically, but also we looked at other student properties in general as well. And we found that very few complaints were made relating to issues about PBSA developments. And then when those issues did occur, which wasn't very frequently, they're managed much more effectively by management companies, etc. So it's slightly sort of different issues occurring and much less frequently. We also spoke to the Student Community Partnership, who very kindly shared some anonymised data on complaints with us. And they also confirmed that very few of the complaints that they receive relate to PBSA, sorry, purpose-built student accommodation, I should say, developments. And that matched our complaints data that we'd mapped, that the council have received as well. So we don't have any evidence available to show that the issues commonly associated with HMOs occur to the same amount or the same type of issues as for PBSA developments, and so we don't have the evidence to justify the inclusion of PBSA within that concentration threshold calculation. And another issue relating to that is that if we were going to include PBSA in that HMO calculation, which we don't have evidence to do, but if we were going to, there are issues with the practicalities of doing that, because we have population sort of data for wards set out in the census, but I think it'd be very difficult to measure the population of a 100-metre radius for every application that came in, because we wouldn't know what the population was for that area. We just don't have that data mapped. We could potentially look at, if we looked at HMOs, we could look at sort of the highest number of people that could be in that HMO as a sort of standard, but we wouldn't be able to know what the population for the general housing population was. So the practicalities are also very difficult. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Alice. I noticed there's one other question on PBSAs. The question is, will local purpose-built student accommodation blocks be taken into consideration when accessing whether a local area is considered to be a balanced community?
So I think that's the same answer as before. No, it won't. So we're not going to use PBSA for the reasons I just explained. We're not going to be including PBSA within that calculation. It's just HMO properties. Excellent,
thank you. The next question is about concentration threshold. Some areas of Bath are already saturated by HMOs. What are the council doing to reverse this?
Yes, that's a question we get asked quite often. It's a tricky one. The council doesn't have any power or any sort of mechanisms within the planning system to require landowners or property owners to change the use of properties, so HMOs, back to residential properties. So areas where there is a high concentration of HMOs already, they won't see any further increase in HMOs, but they also aren't likely to see a decrease either. But what the updated policy does do is it further restricts the intensification of existing HMOs in areas with a high concentration, which it didn't previously. So if an application for, say, a change of use was submitted for, let's say, a 5-bed HMO, which is a C4 use class small HMO, and it was a change of use to let's say a 7-bed HMO, that would need planning permission because it's an intensified HMO. If that was submitted in an area of high concentration, or if it tipped the concentration to 10% or higher, the application would likely be refused, whereas currently that's not the case. So there's no way for the council to reverse the sort of saturated areas, but we are looking to sort of reduce the numbers of HMO occupiers in the areas that are already saturated.
Thank you, Alice. We've got a few other questions, and then I've got one from Deborah Jane, who I'm going to come to in a moment, and Tim may want to come in on that one as well. So firstly, this one is about intensification of existing HMOs, and the question is, does adding an additional bedroom to an HMO count as intensification, and would it be allowed?
So it would depend on whether the additional bedroom triggered a planning application. So an intensification situation would only trigger that planning application if you were turning a small HMO into a large HMO, so from a C4 use class to a sui generis use class. If you are adding a bedroom, but it remains in the same use class and there's no sort of external works that need planning permission separately, then you wouldn't need planning application, so it wouldn't be tested against the tests set out in the SPD. But if you trigger that change of use, then you'd need the planning application, and you would need to meet the policies and the guidance set out in these documents.
Excellent, thank you for that. So this is a point that's been raised by Deborah Jane. She says, how will this excellent framework impact on the situations where Bain's planning committee refuses planning permission and the applicant appeals? In my experience, once the planning inspectorate takes over the decision-making process, it is taken out of local hands completely. Now, I don't know whether that's something either Alice or Carew want to come in, or whether Tim wants to make a comment on that at all.
Shall I take that first? Yeah. Yeah, this is yeah, I understand the concern. So as I mentioned, planning system here is genuinely have to be plan-led. So it's even the inspector is independent. The inspectors have to look at our local plan policies first. So it has to, that's the main sort of policies. So then also, but of course this we have to be complying with the national policies as well. Then the national policy they are updated regularly, and so they inspector will look at our local policy and also what's the latest in the national policy. And also it's as I mentioned, there's a material consideration element. So that when the planning application comes in, they will determine in accordance with the development plans, our local plan, core strategy, placemaking plan, and but unless the material consideration indicates otherwise. So then this material consideration has a weighting. So sometime officers, local communities, inspectors give different weighting in accordance with a national policy and local circumstances. So it is, it feels like we sort of want it to go to the inspectorate, taken out of local hands, but it's what we are trying to do here is we have up-to-date local plan policies. If the applications are determined in accordance with our local plan up-to-date policies, then it should be upheld. So then, so it's we are updating local plan now. Then because the local authority, we have to update every 5 years. So it's really that I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we are updating these local policies so to keep it up to date. And now is the best time for the local communities to get involved. I hope that answers the question.
Tim, did you want to?
Yes, I did want to come in. I mean, plan applications can be an emotive situation for lots of residents, and we know how residents feel sometimes when an application goes through, they don't feel it should. And we understand the frustration, upset they feel when an application has been turned down by the planning committee only to be overturned by the planning inspectorate. The policies coming through now and the framework coming through now firms up the position of what can be refused and what can't be refused. These policies are much clearer now. So when planning committee refuse something, taking the policies into account they're coming through, the inspector shouldn't overturn it. Although, as Karen has already said, they give slightly different weighting to be given, but this will add and strengthen the policies we've got now to make sure that when a decision is taken, it should be stuck to.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, I've got a series of questions now. I've got a number of questions on the EPCC. The first being, why should HMOs be required to achieve a higher standard of energy than other private rented accommodation?
Thank you. So the EPCC rating requirement, it's an attempt to bring that general energy performance of HMOs in line with the general housing stock. I mentioned in the presentation earlier that the district's HMO stock have a much lower proportion of EPCC or higher ratings than the general housing stock, and also often house individuals on lower incomes and or students or young professionals. So the council sees it as an opportunity to try and improve the average EPC ratings of HMOs, which will lower bills for lower income households, and it'll also give those sort of quality improvements that are associated with EPC ratings. So that's the aim of the policy.
Excellent. The next question is, how are landlords advised to change Victorian mid-terrace houses to improve a rating from a DE to a C when other measures have been implemented already?
Sure, yeah. So if all other measures have been implemented, or if no measures can be implemented, because that is possible as well, then an applicant can submit evidence of that alongside their planning application, and then they wouldn't need to meet the requirement. And I ran through the exemptions in the presentation, and the relevant one there is that it relates to situations where all energy efficiency improvements for the property have already been made, and it still remains below EPCC. Yeah, then evidence can be submitted with the planning application, and you wouldn't need to meet that requirement.
Brilliant. And the final point is, will existing HMOs be required to achieve C or better in their EPCs?
No, it's not a retrospective requirement. It's not something that we could do. It's just for new or intensified HMOs, which require a planning application. So only when then a planning application is submitted.
Great. Final question I've got at the moment on my list is one around parking. And does your policy take into account HMO parking issues?
Yeah, good question. Our HMO SPD doesn't take into account parking, but the new Transport SPD, which is being consulted on at the moment, same timeframes as this one, which Carrie mentioned earlier, sets out the new parking standards for HMO properties, which are new. So yeah, if you have a look at the parking SPD, they're set out in there, and you can comment on that in the consultation for the parking SPD. I think it's called Transport and Development SPD. Excellent.
Well, at the moment, I cannot see any further questions that have come in from our audience who are live with us at the moment. Does Alice, Carew or Tim have any final thoughts on what they would like to say on this before we bring the webinar to a close?
I can speak at the moment now. I'd like to thank those people taking part this morning because of the very interesting questions that have come in. I think the officer did very well in answering the questions on some very difficult points that have been raised. It's important that everybody listening passes the message out to other colleagues who are listening out there to take part in the consultation process. We need your help and support to ensure the policies go forward and are sustainable in the future. So thanks everybody so far, but please pass the message on.
Thank you, Tim. And I'd like to reiterate what Tim says. Thank you for giving up your time for attending today. And also, I know Carew has already mentioned about the upcoming consultations, which will continue. So please, if you haven't done so already, please respond to the consultation online or in any other way if you need to do it in another way. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.